Relations between Azerbaijan and Russia will not improve, even if the media shows a reconciliatory image, as Moscow will eventually act again. This opinion was expressed by Vladimir Kopchak, the head of the South Caucasus branch of the Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies during the World and Us project with Yevhen Magda. Even if the current conflict between Baku and Moscow in the media dies down, the toothpaste can't be put back in the tube. It won't happen. Even if an image of understanding is shown, sooner or later Moscow will do something and it will resurface. Even in the most peaceful scenario, something could happen. I agree with your logic that Moscow should behave cautiously, but this is not their style. They feel humiliated after their troops left Karabakh. They feel humiliated by the fact that Nikol Pashinyan managed to push for bilateral negotiations with Ilham Aliyev in a peace process format, he said. Kopchak also noted that Russia feels humiliated for multiple reasons. They feel humiliated because Baku didn't just swallow the downing of a civilian passenger plane in December last year, where 38 people were killed. They feel humiliated because Baku simply demanded a human response. Some people ask why the reaction was so harsh to the downing in Baku, but more people died in Yekaterinburg. This is the same process. It's a direct consequence of a crash or an attack in the sky over Grozny, he added. According to Kopchak, Russia is now increasing pressure on Azerbaijan, and Baku is responding in a measured and occasionally mirrored manner, given its ability to do so. Everything is just beginning, and if we talk about the regional security context, or even the broader geopolitical context, Moscow's main problem is that it seems the Kremlin is now acting in a hybrid way. After the synchronized visits of Ilham Aliyev and Nikol Pashinyan to Turkey, the Kremlin has lost control, as seen in Yekaterinburg and not only in Azerbaijan. Another topic for discussion is the revival of so-called anti-Maidan activities or a coup attempt in Armenia, Kopchak added. Recall on June 28, 2025, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Azerbaijan urgently contacted the Russian authorities. The reason was the events of June 27th in Yekaterinburg, Russia. On June 30th, Azerbaijan's Ministry of Internal Affairs conducted a special operation that resulted in the detention of 2 FSB agents who worked at Russia's Sputnik agency, a branch of the Rossiya Segodnya media group in Baku. In response, Moscow summoned the Azerbaijani ambassador.
Non-Russian citizens will now be allowed to enlist in the military, according to a law signed by President Vladimir Putin. Amendments were made to several legislative acts, including the laws on military duty and military service, on defense, and on the status of military personnel. Under the new law, stateless individuals and foreigners will be able to sign contracts and serve in the military until the end of the mobilization period, the termination of martial law, or the expiration of wartime. The law comes into force from the date of its official publication. It was expedited, in order to take urgent additional measures to restaff the armed forces of the Russian Federation, the explanatory note to the document says. This step actually clearly shows that Moscow is experiencing a serious personnel and military reserve crisis. Because the Kremlin does not want to replenish the army through classical mobilization or does not have the political courage to do so. Experts say that if Putin declares general mobilization, Russians living in large cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg may take to the streets and protest. This is very risky for the regime. At the same time, the most worrying issue is the possibility that thousands of stateless labor migrants, that is, thousands of people working in markets, streets, and construction sites, will already be mass gathered and sent to the army. This process has already partially begun. As is known, in recent months, the head of the Russian Investigative Committee, Alexander Bastyrykin, announced that so far more than 20,000 stateless migrants have been forcibly taken to war zones in Ukraine. Now, This new law fully legalizes this practice and institutionalizes it. That is, migrants taken from the market, the street, and construction sites will be turned into legal soldiers with formal contracts and sent to the front. The law also shows that Russia's defense system is riddled with huge gaps, both in terms of quantity and quality. The shortage of soldiers and the growing public opposition to the war have become major headaches for the Kremlin. That's why Putin is now creating a legal framework to more easily send stateless people, mainly vulnerable people from Central Asia, to the front lines.
Deputy Chairman of the Russian Security Council Dmitry Medvedev distinguished himself with yet another sharp anti-Western rhetoric. He took it out on NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. The message was published on Medvedev's English-language account on the X platform. The reason for the latest outburst was Rutte's words, who admitted that Russia could attack the alliance on orders from Beijing. Medvedev responded with the usual stream of threats and insults. In particular, the Kremlin representative threatened that the Secretary-General would end up in a concentration camp in Siberia. Secretary-General Rutte seems to have eaten too many of the Netherlands' favorite magic mushrooms. He sees a Chinese-Russian conspiracy over Taiwan, and then a Russian attack on Europe. But he is right about one thing. He should learn Russian. It could come in handy in a Siberian camp, Medvedev wrote. This was said in English and posted on his English-language account, which emphasizes the targeted nature of the threat. It was addressed not to Russian society, but to the political West. It is noteworthy that this is not Medvedev's first attack in recent times. At the end of June, he already scared the world with the possible use of nuclear weapons, after which his words provoked a violent reaction, including from US President Donald Trump. He directly stated that such threats are unacceptable. After the shout from Washington, Medvedev rushed to justify himself, saying that he had been misunderstood and that he had meant something completely different. This abrupt retreat suggests that even the rhetoric of the Kremlin's hawks has its limits, especially when Washington responds to them. It is obvious that Medvedev's harsh statements are intended to frighten, blackmail, and sow uncertainty. However, Rutte seems to have decided to ignore the words of the Kremlin representative, who has no influence on anything and is only capable of spewing insults online. Earlier, Medvedev lost his temper after the defeat of Russian aviation, revealing the Kremlin's plans. Medvedev essentially revealed Moscow's true goals on Telegram, stating that the talks in Istanbul are not needed for a compromise peace on unrealistic conditions invented by someone, but for a speedy victory and the complete destruction of the neo-Nazi government. These words were a direct admission that the negotiations were nothing more than a smokescreen. Against the backdrop of huge losses in aviation and unsuccessful rounds in Istanbul, the Russian leadership seemed to have decided to play for broke at the cost of the final collapse of its international reputation.